question for you all, and this is on the handout. What do you think would be most helpful for becoming a better person or leading a more ethical life? Studying ethical theories, studying virtues, studying vices, or just focusing on a role model? Yeah, what's that? Studying the Bible. Would that be the role model then? Seeing how Jesus lived his life?
Well, I think everybody is a role model from Scripture, and that they all teach us something. Some good, some bad. But I think that usually the Lord lets us know which is which.
Yeah, I guess there are more options than four here.
Yeah,
Prayer might be another option.
I'd like to add to that. Yes, but then placing yourself in a community, surrounding yourself with people who are the good role models, the virtues. Continuing ed, because I think we're children the rest of our lives, but our environment is very important.
Yeah, there's a reason parents care so much about.
And that book into that environment.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a reason parents care so much about their kids' peer group.
Yeah.
They might have more influence at a certain age than the family does. What do the rest of you think?
I guess all of the above.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't cross any of them out.
If you look at just family relationships as children are growing up, and this is just my personal evaluation, I'm not a clinical psychologist by any means, but if you live in a household where there are many different ethical role models, you early on have to discern which way you're gonna go. And I think that's where the Spirit kind of leads you. That was my upbringing. A lot of different role models, and
Good role models.
good role models, and then good role models that helped develop an understanding of the poorer role models, I guess. It was complex, but kids kind of learn to discern that and choose.
You took sides.
Well, you kind of have to take sides to survive.
In addition to what you've got here, I think another aspect is self-reflection. I learn best from my mistakes. I learn those lessons again. And it's those times when I've messed it up. And then looking back on it later and go, oh, I should have, or I missed this clue, or I missed this piece, or I forgot to consider this person. So that the next time I come to something similar, I'm predisposed to look for that person. But it's that self-reflective aspect that I think also has a very strong role to play.
Certainly.
And of course, I have a peculiar problem in the sense that, as a lawyer, spending his days in dogfights, where, yes, there are legal ethics, but personal ethics are kind of tough. So when you're done dogfighting, so to speak, trying to restore yourself, okay, that's over. I don't need to, I need to think differently now. And it's not so much just unique to me, but people in competitive occupations need some self-restoring sometimes. So it's different shades of light during the day and during the week.
I think medical ethics are right there with legal ethics.
They're hard sometimes.
Well, your daughter works in the Student Success Center. Do you know what the Student Success Center answer is, and what students would say to this? Can any of you guess?
I don't. She hasn't told me yet.
Any guesses what the college student answer to this question is? It's B, focusing on your strengths. And this is something that the movement of, have you heard of positive psychology? Like psychology some decades ago was just focused on like what's wrong with people when there's something wrong. And then there was a few psychologists in the United States that thought like, what about the rest of us? Like we don't just need to study pathology, we should study like health, mental health, and not just mental illness. And so there was a turn, and there's like a movement in psychology, and Zell can tell you more about this than I can. And so yeah, if you go to Augustana, like in orientation, you take a strengths test, and it tells you it's not just moral virtues, but like what your character strengths are, and then you are recommended to work on those, because like people get excited about working on their strengths more than working on their weaknesses, and you can build on them, you know. So like I've had colleagues tell me this before when I was starting off teaching. I use a lot of humor outside of the classroom, and then like I get very serious in the classroom, and they said like, why don't you build on your strength of humor, because then you can relate to students more. So that's the idea that I hear a lot, and the idea that I hear the least from students is C, that you would study your weaknesses, especially when it comes to moral weaknesses. And in fact, last spring I taught this class, and no one said that, and I brought this up, and they said like, oh, that's such a downer, you know. And I said, but what if something's really wrong with you? And they went like, oh, like they were just like shocked and appalled that I would suggest. But I mean, just imagine like you have various strengths. So I tried to come up with an example that isn't necessarily about me. Imagine that your strengths, you take the strengths test and you find that you have humor, compassion, forgiveness. But suppose your weaknesses are addiction to alcohol, procrastination, depression. I'm not calling these moral weaknesses. I'm just saying these are things you struggle with. Working on humor, being more compassionate and forgiving is not going to help you with your addiction to alcohol or depression or procrastination. So sometimes if something is pulling us down or inhibiting us from thriving, then we need to actually identify what it is. And Aristotle, so I think the reason that students think like, why are you asking if something's wrong with me, is because they think like this is about blame. Mm-hmm. That if we're talking about vice or sin, then we're talking about what you're responsible for, and then what we're going to do is blame you. That's not how Aristotle thought about virtue and vice, partly because he understood it as about like training up children, and because most virtue and vice, these are habits, they're not intentionally chosen, and they are just ways of living that we find ourselves engaging in before we're really conscious of them, and they're very hard to break. So I actually think that things like addictions are very good examples, or at least analogies, to what he's talking about in the moral sphere. I had a student in a different class called How to Live Well. We now have a well-being component of the gen ed, and we've developed our introductory philosophy class to be a well-being component, so they have to come up with like an experiment in living there too. And she identified that she had already identified with a trained psychologist that she is like a compulsive liar, and was working on this in our class. Okay, so on your I'm back on your handout. So the ancient way to think about vices are as disordered desires. So anything that we call a disorder now in psychology, I think would fit in, as well as things that we more traditionally think of as like moral problems. And so what I try to teach the students is that there is a reason to focus not just, I mean, I think all of these, I think you're all right, that all of these ways of approaching ethics are helpful. And I actually think they're all necessary. But so I try to give an argument why also considering our vices is going to lead to moral growth. And the development of virtue ethics, the most famous developer is Thomas Aquinas. And so Rebecca DeYoung was a scholar of Aquinas, and so she's trying to bring this material into the contemporary world. And Aquinas combined reflecting the kind of self-reflection that Ward is talking about on our weaknesses, sometimes with a spiritual director. If we can't identify them ourselves, we find a mentor to help. And then having a vision of what we want to become, and of course the vision would be Christ-like. So Christ is the primary role model, but then there's many other saints in our lives that also fill that role, who might be sort of more tangible to us. And then identifying particular virtues that we want to develop. The moral theory stuff, part A doesn't really figure in at all for them. It's just my preference, because I'm a theory person. So the next few questions I give to students, I pulled these from various days of class. So one way, and if you're familiar with the Jesuit, what is that? What called the
Sect.
what?
Sect.
I'm not sure.
Sect.
Yeah, but there's the spiritual exercises of the Jesuits.
Yeah.
I think this picks up on the same, where you reflect on your strong emotions and your desires as a way to think about where you might need sort of moral work done. And so I'm not going to have you like say all your answers here, but we could take a minute to think. So DeYoung explains that the reason that vices are so attractive to us is because we desire things that are good and that we need, but when we desire them viciously, we are sort of out of joint. So we desire them in the wrong way or to the wrong extent, or we misprioritize things. So for example, the vices that she discusses in this book, so here's a quote from the introduction. She says, lust offers pleasure, avarice promises self-sufficiency, envy and vainglory offer to secure our worth and approval, sloth beckons with comfort, wrath clings to control, pride prizes status, superiority, and power. Well, I'm not sure about superiority, but most of these, like we want love, we want friendship, we want recognition, we want approval, we want security, we want comfort, we want pleasure. And each of these things are good and given to us by God. So the issue is not that it's not like a Buddhist worldview where we are trying to achieve complete detachment. It's just, we want to think about where we might sort of be disordered in our desires. And so she suggests reflecting on where our negative emotions might be pointing us to this kind of disorder. I wanted to read you one other quote about this. this is one part that I don't. I think it's strange to use the word pride in modern day to capture this idea, because I think of pride as something completely different. But the early Christians used the word pride to mean, it's like a catch-all for all of the vices, or it's like the most fundamental one, because it means putting anything in the place of God. So here is the quote. She says, the prideful person takes something else to be her ultimate good, with plenty of options to choose from: pleasure, security, comfort, control, wealth, status, approval, success, reputation. While these are good in themselves, they are not our ultimate good, in the sense that they make us lastingly happy or self-sufficient. A disordered love for one of these can end up coloring all our thoughts and feelings, affecting our priorities, commitments, and interactions with others. We set down grooves and ruts from practice, in the form of daily routines and mental default patterns, and thus habits are formed. But what starts out as apparently fulfilling turns out leaving us empty. So the habitual pursuit of any created thing in God's place leads to unhappiness, self-destruction, and enslavement, as we are overpowered by our habits. So I think another way to self-reflect here, this idea of enslavement, that we think that we're in control, pursuing something that we perceive as good, and then suddenly it's like how an addiction can become enslaving, something that ends up controlling us instead of us controlling it. So that would be another place to think about what needs moral work. And then the last of these questions is what you think the culture itself might be encouraging by way of vice, our culture. So maybe we could start with the last question. Any thoughts on what vices might be more prevalent in our culture and encouraged by the way we live? Yes.
Consumerism.
Materialism,
Yeah.
consumerism. Okay.
Social media.
Social media.
We know too much about people we'll never meet.
We don't care about it.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say wrath has become a virtue. People being aggressive to win.
Okay, yeah.
Retaliation.
I think the
I'm gonna write these down.
individualism of our founding mothers and fathers in pioneer days, but it has become the me culture, meism.
So I want to write all these down because I have like no memory. Materialism, consumerism. There was something in between those and wrath. Social media. And then there were two more after.
Individualism become meism, me first.
Was there one more?
You said
Well, that was like when Ralph, yeah, no.
She used the classic phrases, gluttony and lust.
Retaliation is RA?
No, I was thinking wrath.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
How do you spell retaliation? Looks funny. Okay, you can see my lefty handwriting.
She used the classic language, gluttony and lust.
Okay. This is another one my students are like, the reason I use procrastination as the beginning is because when I ask them on the first day to reflect on their vices, it's like the only one they can come up with. I'm like, that's not really a vice. We'll get to what makes something a vice, but procrastination. I'll sit back down, Julie, so you have an easier time of things.
I like the reference here to sleep. I was was thinking of sloth is laying on the couch and watching TV, but this says resistance to one's spiritual calling, busyness, and workaholism. And I catch myself doing that because I wanna stay busy, and then I don't have to think about whatever's going on over here, and.
It's a replacementism taking place.
Yeah, so some of these seem like more symptoms of an underlying problem than what the problem is. Like social media is just a technology. Social media overuse suggests that there's some need that we are trying to fill. And so thinking about what is the need, what is the desire, I think the same with procrastination. It's a behavior. It's not like a constellation of emotion and cognition and disposition that characterize vices. And students have different theories about why they procrastinate. Sometimes it's perfectionism. They don't want to start something that they think they can't do perfectly, or anxiety about a class. Some of these aren't on the traditional list, and I'd like to think with you about it. But since we've kind of skipped forward, so some of these I think are just more easy to understand. Vainglory, we know what that is, and that might be one reason for social media use. We just crave recognition and approval, and we try to do that by like posting about how great we are on Facebook or whatever. Maybe I'll talk about the practices suggested in the book at the same time. So one idea would be, if we're always trying to justify ourselves, then to refrain from defending ourselves, or if we're all trying to advertise ourselves, then to refrain from that. So different practices of silence might be appropriate, or solitude, doing good things in secret and not telling anyone that we do them. The other things she mentions are what she calls soli deo gloria experiences, and she gives as an example giving birth. So that is not something that when you like hold a newborn baby, you can take credit for. It's just clearly a gift from God. And so if you have experiences where you just feel like blown away by God's gifts, that might be an antidote to vainglory, to just meditate on those. Envy, I didn't understand. I thought it was like covetousness, which is wanting what someone else has. But she identifies envy as less concerned with the thing that you want and more concerned with the person who you're envying, that you think of them as a rival. And we tend to envy people who are sort of close to us and not some like famous person that's just way out of our league. Like, I don't envy Olympic athletes, but I might envy like a colleague who's like a little better than me at something. And so she identifies the cause as not having enough self-love. And so you want to tear down other people because you see everything as a competitive game that you need to win. And so practices she identifies are activities that have shared or common goods, so it's not a zero-sum game. And acts of love for those who you don't think of as your rivals or competitors. Okay, so sloth was the one that was mentioned so far. I also got this wrong. I thought that sloth was being lazy. And she defines it as the opposition to your spiritual calling. And so you can be slothful by being a workaholic because you're escaping, you're avoiding some more fundamental vocation. And in this chapter, she gives an extended analogy to marriage. So if a couple is having difficulties loving each other, and instead of sort of doing the hard work of practicing love, they just avoid the problem, that would be kind of like the escapism. And she also in this chapter discusses the is it Evagrius? Is this the monk? Is that how you say his name? Okay, so he had trouble with sloth. And he described the trouble as the noonday demon who, like, in the middle of the day comes and whispers in your ear, like, why did you come here? This place isn't for you. You should abandon it. And makes the day seem very long and makes you dislike everybody you're with. And so he taught that the practice, the antidote for this is stabilitas loci, staying in place, not abandoning. Just it's not really even doing anything. It's just being.
Evagrius of Pontus. So that stability is one of our Benedictine vows. Yeah, and it's in different contexts too. Physical location and the stability, spiritual stability, emotional stability. You go on and on and on and on, and recognizing that, if that stability is off.
I think this one's important for college students, and I feel like I'm an interested party because we are supposed to be promoting retention. We don't want a lot of students to drop out, but I also think a lot of students drop out for bad reasons, and if they just practiced stability, that maybe they are supposed to be where they are. But anyways, another practice similar is keeping the Sabbath. And that comes up in a few of these. Avarice is basically greed. I think maybe we don't need to talk about that one as much. Wrath is like too much anger. All of these are supposed to be a mean between extremes. So you can have too much or too little of something. Like, think about courage. You could be rash, being fearless, or you could be cowardly. Gluttony and lust I usually do together on the last day because we're running out of time and I don't want to spend a whole day on lust with college students. But they're also quite similar. So gluttony isn't eating too much. It's not being fat. It's about a state of mind, and lust is the same way. And I'm bringing the second edition here because she's really changed her thinking about lust since the first edition. But she emphasizes that food and sex are meant to be enjoyed. And if you have like an eating disorder and you don't enjoy eating at all, like something is wrong. That's why it's a disorder. That's why we identify that you need help. And so in that day, I try to emphasize that if you're gonna take, and a lot of students take up fasting as a practice for this class, we're not trying to lose weight. This might not be the right practice for you. In her chapter, she gives up snacking and realizes that she was scheduling her whole day around little treats, and that she could power through her day, and coffee as well. And that when she gave them up, she realizes more how dependent she was and how this was controlling her.
The Eastern Church has, they talk about fasting is not meant to deprive you of anything. Mm-hmm. It is meant to give you self-awareness that something may have control over you instead of you over it. And they have multiple fasting periods throughout every year, year in, year out, because you have that constant reminder of, have I let this certain thing get ahead of me? Does it have control over me this year or not? So it's just every year, constantly, it's that, this isn't to deprive you of anything, it's to bring you self-awareness.
every time I grab a handful of M&Ms, I have control. Something like that.
Until your endorphins go.
Yeah, we have a number of Ethiopian and other African students that come from Orthodox churches that just have like, this week's no dairy, this week no eggs, or whatever. So I do have a second handout, which is the assignments for the class, but I did skip over a little bit. So you might wonder, like, why these? Why is, like, where's cruelty? Capital vices, isn't that like the deadly ones, the like capital punishment? So she explains capital doesn't mean the worst. It means like the head. So the ones that, I think of this as rather like the thing that gives rise to the rest, the fount, the roots of the tree. And if you're being cruel, it might be because you're envious. It might be because you're wrathful. People generally aren't just cruel for no reason because they enjoy being cruel. And the final chapter of the book, and I really recommend reading it and using it as like a spiritual discipline. The last chapter goes over how to come up with your own spiritual disciplines. She thinks that they need to be comprehensive, concrete, and communal. So comprehensive, she gives as an examples slowing. So it's not just giving up your M&Ms, but practicing slowing. So that might help with wrath. If you're like always in a hurry, and so you get really mad when people are slow, and they like, you get road rage or something. So slowing down. Or hospitality, like that's comprehensive. Concrete, they have to be repeated actions. And communal, it's impossible or almost impossible to do these without the support of a community. There's a lot of psychological research outside of the Christian religion that says that it takes about 40 to 50 days to develop a habit. So I think this is really interesting that, like, from the start, 40 has been identified as a really important number for the kind of Lenten disciplines. 40 to 50 if you include your Sundays. Okay, so here it's 2 pages, I apologize. I'm going to just pass them around. So I took this from a woman named Claire Peterson who gave a presentation at a conference, and she was using this book, and she was giving this assignment. And I've edited it slightly over the last 2 years. But the students have to do 2 assignments at the end of the semester. They don't do 40 to 50 days. Different activities take different amounts of time. And you can probably see how they're related to different vices. You know, if vainglory is your issue, then you might try option 5, a me fast, or social media detox. Envy might also be approached through a social media detox. Sabbath can help with a lot of these. If slowing is important for dealing with wrath, then Sabbath might help. You might take a Sabbath from consumerism if avarice is your issue. It certainly will help with sloth. Not sure about gluttony or lust.
By Sabbath, do you mean separating yourself a day from the other 6 days, or are you talking about going to church?
No, I'm talking about taking a day where you do not do any work. The students, I mean, it's different than when I was in college. They are much more concerned with grades and GPA, and they are much more concerned about finances. They're much more concerned about employment, and they are like very anxious. It's kind of sad. There is some survey that I give them in How to Live Well that shows that, like, I think it was in the 90s, students were surveyed about, like, what's the most important thing you want to get out of college. And it used to be, like, issues about meaning and vocation Now it's just like, I need to get a job to make money. So I think Sabbath is important, and many of our students are not Christian. So this is an ethical perspective among others that they try on. But if they, some of these have like the option of adding prayer, like when you're fasting, but you don't have to add prayer. You can also just read about issues of poverty. And for Sabbath, you don't have to go to church or any kind of religious institution, but that's an option for them. Thoughts?
Well, which one of these assignments are usually chosen?
Well, I had a lot of fasting. I rewrote it because they were fasting for too long, and we have so many athletes. I was worried that I was doing them harm. So now I want them to have breakfast in the morning. So it's not even like a Ramadan kind of fast. That's a popular one. I do get a lot of people writing the difficult letter, either forgiving or asking for forgiveness. I would say all of them have a few students do them, and after the first one is due, they meet in groups and talk about what they did with people who did the same thing as them, and then they choose a second activity. And they're pretty spread out.
Does anybody give up their phone?
Yeah, more do give up social media than their phone. And I can kind of understand why, because if I had to give up my phone, I'd be extremely anxious. Like, what if there's an emergency and the students are away from their families? I guess they can still use email. So,
On their laptop or whatever?
yeah.
So when you say social media with a student population, what do they think of?
Like Twitter, or it's not called Twitter anymore.
X.
X.
The social media formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah. And TikTok and
Snapchat.
Yeah.
I use Facebook, but that's like an old person thing now, I guess.
So is Twitter.
Yeah, some of them say, can I use ones that just use the messaging part? And I'm like, I don't know. You decide what's gonna work for you. Yeah.
Now, from my age bracket, it's really hard to discern what the teenagers think of as social media. You know, when I watch my grandson engrossed in his phone playing a game, to me that's okay, well, somebody else is controlling that game. To me, that's social media. You know, to me, it's anything that involves taking your time when you're not really cognizant of how much time you're spending.
Or where you are sometimes.
As to where you are.
You just, inside the device is where you live now.
Crosswalk accidents happen in the city.
In grocery stores with grocery carts. On the phone.
I used to work retail and as a supervisor. The employees were not to have their phones with them during the day. And there were a couple people that quit because they couldn't stand to be away from their phone. And I said, one of them, she said, I'm gonna quit, and I said, why? She says, you can't carry my phone. I said, you can't carry your phone? I mean, you can't carry yourself away for, I said, why don't you try just doing it for an hour? And then maybe 2 hours. Oh, no, I gotta have it. And I'd go quit.
Oh my.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
I
an
guess
addiction.
I
That
have
seems like
a
an
lot of
addiction.
sympathy for that. I didn't get a cell phone until my 20s because I was living in the sticks in New Hampshire and there was no cell phone coverage. And I didn't get a smartphone till I was near 30. But I already feel like
I got my first one this year.
my kids, they only seem to get sick at school when neither me nor George is available. And so this happened once, and you know, a kid throwing up at school, and neither of us could be reached. And I feel terrible about it to this day. And so I always feel like, what if they can't get in touch with me? You know, what if something terrible happens? It's just, and it's very hard to reduce use without just pulling off the Band-Aid entirely. But I think especially for teens and 20s, if you pull off the Band-Aid entirely, you are like an outcast. You know, you can't have friends because you're not included in any plans. You don't know what everyone's talking about.
You lose community.
Yeah.
It's a new reality.
So
But it can become addictive,
I think we need
overdone.
I think we need some help from psychologists and not philosophers for like, my kids haven't reached this age yet, so I feel like I have some time, but how to approach phone use, that's not just, we take it away from you at this time, and you know.
Yeah. We were talking about social media at work just a couple of weeks ago, and we ended up going back to a few of us older employees talking about our development even in kindergarten. Kindergarten and elementary school were our communities growing up. You knew your fellow students, you knew what was going on at home, you know, and so looking at today's kindergartners in elementary school, high school, some of these kids have no idea. They may know 3, 4 of their students out of a 1,500 graduating class, you know, so that community is no longer there for some of these young kids, and that community is replaced by social media. Then this is available, so bury your face here. You know, if you don't have this community, you can have this. You know, and it was interesting between the views of the older employees and the younger. You know, and it all boiled down to this view of community that one group had, this group does not, and this group has replaced that with the social. My community is on social media now, you know, where I know my friends in New York and San Francisco and whatnot, and not the local. You know, they've never met these people, but they're now their community. It was very interesting.
It might not even be real. Somebody else.
I have a close college friend who lives in Charleston, and a friend that he developed through living in Charleston has included me in this huge, you know, probably 30 or 40 people in all these things he sends, or that they send each other, and they originate from most of them went to prep school together in North Carolina at a residential prep school, and the stuff they send is simply awful. I mean, you know, it's not lewd, it's not. I mean, but it's so narrow that they all simply live in this world of alike.
Very small bubble.
And it's terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, these aren't evil people. These are very smart, predominantly successful people who just are in this tiny world. They don't know anything else. And of course that, you know, can be, it's generally not kids' problems. I mean, that's not the problem they get from social media, but it's a huge, obviously a huge problem in America today. Going to public school here when I was growing up, alike wasn't there. Everybody was,
Individual.
You were constantly surrounded by people who are not like you. Right? And from kindergarten through public high school. I mean, yes, you have friends, but then you know so many people that you see that are just not like you at all. And our current culture is the opposite. So.
I've taken to following a couple of deep red organizations online, and one of them is medical, and the other is, I don't know if you've heard it, but the Hillsdale College.
Oh, yeah.
And the funny thing is that when they give a webinar or whatever, and you start reading the comments, and somebody will pop up a comment or a question like, well, what do you mean by this term? Because the term is just used over and over and over. What do you mean by that term? And all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. And everybody says, well, if you don't know, then you don't belong here. If you don't know, you must be a communist Democrat. And it's like, whoa, where did that come from? Well, that's how they want.
We're near the end here, it's 5 to 10, but can I ask one question? Under gluttony and lust, you have a reference to Aristotle saying all virtue a mean between extremes.
The golden mean.
And I've read most everything Aristotle wrote. I had to in college, but I've forgotten what this means, or how you get there. How is it?
For gluttony and lust, or in general?
Well, no, I'm just talking about the Aristotle saying all virtue a mean between extremes.
Well, so gluttony, to take as an example,
Moderation is virtue.
would be that you have to have the right relationship with food. Just like courage is the right relationship to fear and danger.
And I'm not speaking specifically of gluttony and lust. I'm making reference generally to that concept that Aristotle.
Yeah, I think just by way of many examples, he came to this conclusion that everything is, in moderation in some way.
Well, that's where, especially the idea of pride, that pride is not debasing yourself. Pride is somewhere in between the excess of pride and the deficiency of pride. That's somewhere in the middle. Like you have to have some pride. Or how do you feel about your accomplishments? How do you feel when you got that diploma from college and you're in your cap and gown and all of that? You can take pride in your accomplishments, but just remember, other people can take pride in that too. And what your pride should not do is run down the other people's pride.
Yeah, so humility is being right-sized. That's how I've been taught. Arlene is saying we have to go to church. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thanks
Leigh.
so very much.
Thank you.
It was very, very